Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. I also rise today to speak on the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission, ACNC Bill 2012. And as the title suggests, Mr Acting Deputy President, the bill seeks to establish a new statutory office to be a Commonwealth-level regulator for the not-for-profit sector called the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission. Now, let me be clear up front. Mr Acting Deputy President, the Coalition does oppose this bill, and we do so on the basis that despite the intent, the new regulator would hinder, not help, civil society. And I do want to acknowledge the previous contributor to this debate, Senator Stevens, who does have a genuine interest in the not-for-profit sector and has done over many years, but on this occasion I respectfully disagree with the conclusion that she has reached. Mr Acting Deputy President, a robust civil society is a reflection of the sort of country that we are. It's built through people who choose to freely associate with organisations and causes that are important to them. Australia does have a strong and diverse not-for-profit sector that thrives on community spirit and goodwill. We all know of local carer groups in the cities and towns that we live in, the sporting clubs, which as members of Parliament we all have associations with, and we all know that these networks and associations and clubs are sustained by people who volunteer their time and their energy to causes that matter to them and to organisations that they see as important. It is the view of the Coalition that the state should be there to be at the service of civil society and to make life easier for civil society. We do start on this side of the chamber, firstly with the principle that the government should do no harm to the efforts and endeavours of the not-for-profit sector. Government should be a facilitator, but it shouldn't intrude upon the operation of the not-for-profit sector. The government's proposal here, enshrined in this bill for a new regulatory body, is, I think, what you might call a typical Labor reform in inverted commas. The intent is fine and worthy and noble, but the reality in the text of the legislation we think would lead to an altogether different outcome. When the new regulator was proposed, the primary objective was to reduce administrative compliance and reporting duplication for the not-for-profit sector. And the intent of that was to allow these organisations to direct more of their limited resources and time to what is their core business. We don't believe that the bill in its current form does justice to the original objective. One of the key aims of the legislation is supposedly to reduce red tape for the not-for-profit sector. We don't think that it will do that. And unless the states and territories agree to hand over their powers to the Commonwealth and also agree to harmonise their laws, these bills would add an additional layer of red tape, which the sector would have to meet. Now, Susan Pascoe, the head of the interim commission, or the Commission Implementation Task Force, has stated that you're only going to achieve full red tape reduction with the involvement of the states and territories. Now, the states and territories have to date declined to hand over any of their powers with respect to charities and not-for-profits. In fact, they're highly critical of the proposed commission. The Commonwealth hasn't had a terrific track record, it must be said, of negotiating with the other jurisdictions. They do tend to try and seek to blame and scapegoat the states at every opportunity. Mr Acting Deputy President, the proposed commission does treat Australian not-for-profits as though they're not entirely to be trusted. The legislation has a range of powers to interfere in the internal workings of an organisation, which I think has the potential to jeopardise the independence of civil society. The bill gives the Commission the power to deregister an organisation if it's deemed to be conducting its affairs in a way that might cause harm or threaten the public trust or confidence in the not-for-profit sector. And while that's a noble sentiment, it's a very, very strong power for a government to be able to actually deregister a not-for-profit. The phrase public trust and confidence in the legislation is ambiguous and does create uncertainty as to what that phrase, what that definition actually is. And no doubt if this legislation was passed, it would ultimately be the courts who may determine what that phrase means. The bill does provide the ACNC Commissioner with a range of enforcement powers that I think go far beyond what's necessary. The Commission would have the authority to issue warning notices, issue directions, enter into enforceable undertakings, apply to the courts for injunctions, suspend or remove responsible entities and appoint acting responsible entities. These sorts of provisions are disproportionate, I think, for the potential risk that there is in the sector. We think that when it comes to the not-for-profit sector, you shouldn't be adopting so much of a risk minimisation policy, rather a risk management policy. Where the risk is low, government should have a light touch, and we think that the powers proposed here aren't commensurate with the level of risk that they are excessive. As I've said, the powers and penalties contained in the bill are pretty heavy-handed, but also of concern is the Commissioner's ability to remove the director of a not-for-profit. In his submission to the House of Representatives inquiry into the legislation, Mr David Gonski of the Australian Institute of Company Directors raised the issue that Australia may be the first country in the world to make being a not-for-profit as a director more onerous than being on a for-profit. The bill is, in short, a bad piece of legislation. What was supposed to create a one-stop shop for charities has created an environment that, in effect, undermines confidence in the not-for-profit sector. There is no agreement with the states to harmonise powers. There would be duplication of reporting requirements, and the onerous compliance obligations would have the potential to discourage community involvement and volunteers from becoming involved in local organisations. There are approximately 600,000 entities in Australia's not-for-profit sector. They're made up of people who give their time and their energy to many Australians who greatly need it. The Coalition has a different approach. We reject the legislation. We won't be supporting the creation of a heavy-handed regulatory body that would only add to red tape and compliance burdens for the not-for-profit sector. The government should seek to work with the sector rather than treating it as an arm of the state. I think that the level of intervention that this Act seeks to give government the capacity to exercise is a reflection of the Labor Party's philosophical approach. We should make sure that government is of service to Australia's civil society, that it shouldn't hinder it. That's what the Coalition will endeavour to achieve. We do oppose the legislation, and as my colleagues have indicated already, if we have the opportunity, we shall repeal it. pardon me. As I said at the commencement of my remarks, and now that she's in the chamber, again I'll repeat them, that I do respect Senator Stevens' interest in and contribution in the not-for-profit sector and the charitable sector over a long period of time. I listened to her contribution, but on this occasion I respectfully have reached a different conclusion to her.